Bonjour. Donc, on va recommencer notre après-midi. Et comme on disait, on va donner importance aussi aux pratiques curatoriales comme espace des possibilités ou des tensions avec les communs. Et on commence avec notre première conférence de Marco Baravalle. C'est vrai, désolé. J'ai besoin de faire une annonce importante, c'est que notre dernière conférence de Patricia Olliard aura lieu en anglais. Elle a dit, tiens, peut-être en espagnol, que ça pourrait être très bien parce qu'on est très proche de l'Espagne, mais elle va le faire en anglais pour peut-être permettre mieux la compréhension, j'imagine, plus générale. Et donc, merci Patricia. Et Marco Baravalle, qui va parler depuis ici. Je pense qu'il y a les petites... Non, c'est là Marco. Ouais. Donc, Marco est chercheur culturel et activiste. Il est membre de Sail Docs, un espace collectif et indépendant des arts visuels et de l'activisme du théâtre expérimental, et situé dans ce qui était l'entrepôt abandonné de Dorso Duro à Venise. C'est là-bas, ça a été fondé en 2007, et c'est là-bas aussi où il enseigne à la Nuova Accademia de Belle Arti.
UAV University of Venice.
C'est vrai, voilà, UAV University of Venice, d'où vient aussi Jacopo Galimberti. Donc, il a reçu une bourse Fulbright en 2022 pour passer 6 mois la chance à CUNY, à New York. Et il est membre de IRI, Institute of Radical Imagination, un collectif qui invite des politologues, des économistes, des juristes, des architectes, des hackers, des activistes, des artistes et des producteurs culturels à partager leurs connaissances sur une base continue, de mettre en œuvre des sons des post-capitalismes dans le sud de l'Europe méditerranée. Je pense qu'il y a eu un projet à Musée Reina Sofia, yes, n'est-ce pas? Et il a été associé au projet In Common, éloge de la communauté, créativité partagée dans les arts et la politique en Italie entre 1959 et 1979. Donc vous voyez bien que sa contribution a tous les sens dans cette symposium, et on est très remerciant de t'avoir, et tu as la parole pendant 30 minutes. On va essayer de rester dans le temps dans l'après-midi pour avoir le temps des débats et finir plus ou moins à l'heure. Merci Marco.
Merci bien à toi, à Paola, à Sonia pour l'invitation à cette journée très intéressante, et merci à tout le monde d'être là. Bonjour, ça va? Vous allez bien? C'est important. Et alors, je m'excuse, mais je vais parler anglais parce que j'ai complètement oublié mon français. Cette phrase, je les avais préparées il y a 2 jours. C'est pour cela que ça ressemble. Je suis parlé français, mais je peux pas. Alors, so thank you once more. So my intervention is titled Art Commons and Neoliberal Capture, Curating at the Turn of 1968. So before going deeper into the topic of my talk, I have a little premise, because I was thinking about a few things that also Paola mentioned during the opening of this day. So how to define common as a principle in relation to art or to visual culture. And I thought of my own archaeology of the common, and you will see that it goes back to 1968, the years around 1968, so late 60s, until the present day, even if today we will kind of more stay focused on the 60s and the 70s and on the figure of the curator, and specifically that of Harald Zeman. But my idea of common in relationship to art is informed by both my research as a precarious researcher and an art activist within social movements. Indeed, as Paola mentioned, I am part of a self-managed, formerly occupied space in Venice, which is called Sale Docs. And It is, I think, one of the few non-neoliberal art spaces still remaining in a city like Venice, which is really colonized by big private financial capitals that open their own museums or art spaces in Venice. Just a few spaces are left for art commons in the city where I live, and I think that the collective I'm part of is one of those spaces. I also think of common as a situated and embodied principle, and indeed this sort of premises my leader exercise of positioning my voice within today's context. And when I think of common in art, I think of something that is traceable where alternatives to neoliberalization of art are at work. What do I mean? And some of these points are going to be, let's say, highlighted during the speech. So common in art is at work. This list is, of course, not exhaustive, where collective agency is cultivated rather than individual genius of networking. So common as an alternative not only to individuality and the romantic category of the genius, but also as an alternative to networking, as an alternative to relational aesthetics, as an alternative to this sort of dialogical space that contemporary art constitutes, with somehow or sometimes very positive effects, but also with the effect of diffusing, capturing what is subversive in the commons. So second, where social antagonism and decolonized dialectics are not excluded or captured by different dispositives, what I was saying. So the insistence that we see since the 90s, especially within the field of curatorial discourse, on dialogue, on exchange, on relational aesthetics, it is, in my opinion, and not only in my opinion, we could mention many scholars that focus on this as problematic, because it excludes antagonism, it excludes conflicts from within the sphere of contemporary art and in general from within the sphere of the aesthetics. Then the antagonism I refer to is not the one, for example, summoned by Claire Bishop when she criticizes relational aesthetics. It's not only or simply something that is internal to the artwork, but I also somehow refer to social antagonism. So common is work where independence does not mean a flight from institutions to become a free individual on the market, but where, on the contrary, a radical institutional reform or invention is operated, what I called alter institutionality. I'm not focusing on this because this is going to be the focus of the whole intervention. Another space or moment when we see common at work, where art autonomy is achieved through the end of its heteronomy vis-a-vis neoliberal valorization. So be it through market, real estate rent, academic hierarchies, debt, financialization, etc. So it may be surprising in this context, but I'm a big believer in the autonomy of art. But when I think of autonomy of art, like I was saying before in dialogue with Jacopo's intervention, I think that today mainly autonomy of art must be achieved by liberating art from its neoliberal capture, from its financialization. And finally, last but not least, where class, gender, race, and species privileges are identified and properly addressed. And I think this is pretty obvious. And it's very easy to identify those privileges. Every art exhibition does it. It is much, much more problematic to properly address I would say challenges, because it would entail, at least in my opinion, an institutional transformation, which is much harder to achieve than simply denouncing. Let me just close this part by saying that I see also the art commons at work in the streets in Toulouse, these days. And in general, in France, during this period, I passed by what I think is the Institute of Art Etudes, I don't know, the Institut des Arts de Toulouse, and they have amazing banners hanging outside the window. So somehow I'm a believer of the power of art in its autonomy, following Jacques Rancière, when he says that art autonomy is a sign of its radicality, because even in the darkest time, even in the most reactionary time, art is what gives us what he calls the vision of a world to come, of new forms of life in common. And I'm almost like exactly quoting the words of Rancière. And at the same time, this is how Rancière describes what he calls the aesthetic regime of art. Art works, the radicality of art always works through its annihilation within the social, from the historical avant-garde onwards. And this is what we see at work in the streets in Toulouse, for example, this day. So autonomy on one side, but on the other side, also the fact that art commons become more radical and grow when social commons grow. So this parallel, I think, it's also what we have been seeing in some of the things that were shown before my intervention. Harald Seemann and the capture of the spirit of 1968. So my little story starts here with two seemingly very different events that took place more or less at the same time. On July 3rd, 1969, Turin was the scenario for the so-called revolt of Corso Traiano, or Battle of Corso Traiano. So a unified assembly of workers and students called for an autonomous demonstration without the official unions supporting the demonstration. The theme was the fight for housing rights and the fact that rents were becoming too high for working class people in Turin. Was a massive demonstration that was met by a huge police violence, and clashes kind of continued during the whole night. And this was historically taken as the first moment of the so-called Italian autumn, which was the autumn of 1969, one of the highest moments of social struggles in the history of Republican Italy. So like a moment in which an epic of labor was at work. And when, of course, together with students, but factory workers, the so-called mass workers, were the central subject of a massive, of a mass mobilization through Italy, that then was a sort of moment that linked 1968 to the 70s. In Italy, we speak of a long 1968 because basically the social mobilization continued with a very high intensity until 1977, 1979. A few days before, June 30, 1969, Harald Seemann resigns as curator of the Bern Kunsthalle. Why do I put side by side things that sound and look so different? Because my idea today is to try to sketch an unusual portrait of Harald Seemann, not as the individual heroic genius Ausstellungsmacher, maker of exhibition, that he was historicized as, but the career of Harald Seemann and the way he was historicized as a possible trajectory that somehow identifies the general traits of the new cognitive worker. So on the backdrop of 1968, Seemann's development of independent curating, he is seen as the inventor of independent curating, appears as a successful attempt at capturing the spirit of 1968 and offers an early model for the flexible cognitive worker. The reason of Zeman's model's success is to be found in the defeat of 1968 movements and the affirmation of neoliberalism. Maybe I'm a bit too affirmative here, but I could say that at least one of the reasons why the model of Zeman became hegemonic, it is because 1968 and the social movements of the 70s were basically defeated, and somehow some of their instances were absorbed by the new spirit of capitalism or the new model of production towards an anthropology of labor, which is an anthropology of labor which it is much more autonomous, much more flexible, much more independent. At the same time, you know, this part of my research is also addressed at taking out from invisibility other curatorial and art options that were on the field during 1968 and were much more, I would say, not simply in tune with the spirit of 1968, but were part of the body, you know, of 1968. So we often talk about, you know, like overcoming binarism and overcoming Descartes. So here I think that it is important to mention other models of curating, which were not simply absorbing a dematerialized spirit of 1968, but were actually in the body of that subjective and historical turn. So the reflux of 1968 partially invisibilized other attempts at transforming curatorial practices. And one possible example among many is the work of a kind of traditional art critic and curator, the Italian critic and curator Enrico Crispolti, but a very short phase of his work from 1973 to 1977, in which somehow Crispolti, which is otherwise known for being a militant critic and curator, so someone militant, not in a political sense, in the sense that he was also very careful about present-day art in the time, during the time he was active, and also someone who, for example, studied futurism, for example, so much more with a much more art historical approach. But from 1973 to 1977, his works sees a very radical acceleration. And I'm interested in these types of accelerations because I'm also interested in analyzing how counter-hegemonic and common drives became part of what Michel Foucault could call l'ordre du discours, the order of discourse. So somehow how those drives became hegemonic and contributed to shifts or tectonic shifts in the consideration, for example, of the role and function of the artist or in the role and function of art institutions. Why can I, on what basis, as a researcher, I can argue that Harald Zeman captured somehow the spirit of 1968? Harald Zeman is not known for being like a radical or an anarchist or a communist whatsoever. But if you trace some sources, you can find a pattern. You can find a repetition. The fact that Harald Zeman narrates the way he invented or put together the profession of independent curator, linking it very much to the climate of subversion of the movements of 1968. For example, I'm quoting two passages that you can find in the famous interview that he did with Hans-Ulrich Obrist in Paris in 1995, where he says, it was during that period, 1968, that the hostility to foreign workers in Switzerland began to manifest itself. A political party was even founded to lower the number of foreigners in Switzerland. I was attacked since my name was not Swiss, but Hungarian. In response, I founded the Agency for Spiritual Guestwork. I'm sorry, my German is worse than my French, which was a political statement, since the Italian, Turkish, and Spanish workers in Switzerland were called guest workers. The agency's main enterprise was a one-man enterprise, a kind of institutionalization of myself, and its slogans were both ideological, replace property with free activity, and practical, from vision to nail, which meant that it did everything from conceptualizing the project to hanging the works. It was the spirit of 1968. So somehow you see how loaded this statement is. You have, for example, replace property with free activity. It means like a direct theoretical critique of ownership, of private property, of property as someone. This is something that Zeman develops in other parts. You can find in its writings, in its diary. He felt, let's say, the oppression of property as something that was linked to his work as an institutional curator in Bern, because in another place he says, I wanted to become independent because I was fed up to the fact that I wanted to focus on art, I wanted to focus on presence, I wanted to focus on attitudes, and what I was doing instead was to raise the financial value of artists, of objects or traces. Or we've been talking about the division of labor, from vision to nail. So this idea of a deep critique of the division of labor. So the curator as someone that takes upon himself both material and immaterial labor. And he directly mentions the spirits of 1968. And another quote, when Obrist asks him about his resignation from Bern and about when attitudes become form, he answers, naturally this provoked reactions. The local newspapers also accused me of alienating traditional audiences, but we also attracted a new audiences. The membership increases from blah, 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 blah. It was the 1960s and the zeitgeist has changed. Again, this idea of the 60s, a new zeitgeist, a new atmosphere that pushed him to innovate what now we call or we recognize as the profession of the independent curator. To me, in order to prove my point, in order to prove the fact that somehow, so basically Zeman left the Kunsthalle of Bern in 1969 to become this one of the first independent curators. We all know that his main innovation was the thematic exhibition. Until then, many or most of exhibition or most curators were dealing with exhibitions that somehow dealt with the state of art, that were not thematic, that were mainly addressed at giving the audience a picture of the last developments of contemporary art. We know that this changes with Zeman, with this insistence on authorship, with his insistence of the exhibition as a specific medium, alongside painting, sculpture, and so on and so forth, and with the curator becoming an artist, and all the controversy that this then caused during the years to come. What is also interesting, going back to the first quote, is that many times when we think about the development of the profession of the independent curator, we think of the independent curator as an artist. But Zeman gives us, at least in that quote, another genealogy. The independent curator doesn't come from the will to become an artist, but it comes from a sort of solidarity towards migrant workers. This is also interesting in terms of narration, in terms of imposing a certain discursive framework around it. And what is instrumental to me in order to prove the point of this capturing by Zeman of the spirit of 1968, in order to somehow educated to become a further development of neoliberalism. It's the very well-known work by Boltanski and Chiapello, The New Spirit of Capitalism, originally published in French in 1999. And I'm sorry if I'm repeating very well-known stuff, but basically the focus is on 1968 in France and how 1968 was defeated by what would be called neoliberalism, by capitalism, by new forms of management, and by not only through repression, but also through the reorganization of the production model by capitalism in a more flexible way. And basically, when they describe the social movements of 1968 in a rather schematic way, let me also say before that I think the scheme by Chiapello and Boltanski works when applied to France. It doesn't work when applied to Italy, because in Italy, the spirit of 1968 was not absorbed kind of painlessly, but it was, it burst out throughout all the 70s with very radical social mobilizations, eventually exploded in the movement of 1977. And the spirit was not captured or absorbed, but it was violently repressed. It was repressed through jail, it was repressed through police violence, it was repressed through heroin, and so on and so forth. So still, in order to prove my point, the historical reading of French 68 by Boltanski and Chiapello is very useful. So they divided social movements basically in two. On one side, social critique, which is associated with the history of the working class movements and is stressing exploitation, basically the factory workers. And the social critique is basically focused on values such as solidarity, equality, and social security, while on the other side, as a sort of allied or as a sort of a parallel or mixed critique, the artistic critique, which they derive from intellectual and artistic circles, especially in the 19th century Parisian Bohemia. They go as back as to going to Baudelaire to trace the origins and the genealogy of artistic critique. And the artistic critique is more focused on the dehumanization of the capitalist sphere as its particular target, on alienation, on the authoritarian everyday life, on the patriarchal model, and so on and so forth. And what it expressed were more values such as authenticity, freedom, mobility, but also autonomy as independence. And how, and one way the social movements were defeated in 1968, according to Boltanski and Chiapello, was, of course, through repression, but also through the fact that capitalism integrated in its own management structure requests from artistic critique, requests of more autonomy, more flexibility, loosen hierarchies, mobility, networking. If you pay attention, I mentioned 5 traits, which are absolutely traits of the way art workers and even researchers in academia work today. Still, with the cost of acquiring this autonomy, independence, flexibility, networking was to lose social security and somehow to go towards a model of independence which is much more individualism than solidarity. Kuba Schroeder, yep, 5 minutes, okay, I'm on the second slides, but you, sorry, my bad, you get the point. Let me just run. So all what Zeman did basically was to somehow interpret those pushes toward independence, and somehow now his trajectory looks like a prototype of the flexible cultural worker. So it is true that he abandoned any fixed institutional role, so he resigned from the Custale of Bern, but he did not resign in order to, let's say, to revolutionize or to radically reform, for example, the role of our institutions within society, but he resigned from Bern in order to better navigate the market as a free entrepreneur of himself. And this is a model that is still with us. The fact that nowadays independent curators are mainly entrepreneurs of the self that kind of freely and randomly navigate the free market of cultural industry and academy and biennials and residencies and so on and so forth. So the first trait of this capture is that if we think of Zeman, independence and autonomy, we're faced with a model of worker whose autonomy is expressed mainly through a flight from the institution and not through the attempt to radically transform it. Moreover, the independence on another institution, the market is never questioned. He never, ever questions the fact that he needs to get autonomy from the market. He needs instead to better navigate it without the ties that the institution impose on him. Second, whose autonomy declines as a deeply individualistic and entrepreneurial matter. Hyperconnection and cooperation are seen as a necessary condition for entrepreneurial success. So is also why is so praised by the generation of super curators of the 90s, by Nicolas Bourriaud, Hans Ricobris, and all that star company, because he was a prototype of this global, mobile, hyper-connected, archival curator. But again, how do we evaluate this global space of art interconnections and relations? Is it a utopian space for the commons, or is it much more neoliberal globalized network in which, by the way, if we think of the evolution and if we think of curators of the 90s, in which a position of hegemony within the market is not achieved mainly through authorship, like it was still for Zeman, but it was achieved through the capacity to map the world, to map globalization, and to effectively create contacts among those different islands of mobilization, of globalization, I'm sorry. So again, this is another example in a nutshell of how a common drive, a drive for interdependence, a drive for créolisation, a drive for mutual dialogue, it is somehow becomes an ambivalent space where commons and individual competitions on the market merge, whose reference, the worker whose reference to radical politics goes hand in hand perfectly with the neoliberal anthropology of labor, and a worker to whom profits sound less interesting than status through the building of her professional identity. And I think we are all there. If we choose a career in the art world nowadays, we're all much more, we care much more about our professional identity than about our money. It's not like this for everybody, but mainly if you read and study, you know, like studies on anthropology of cultural and art labor, this comes back all the time. And this is another trait that Zeman was somehow pioneering, let's say, because many times when he's interviewed, he argues that by being embedded in one institution, he would have much more money than what he did by becoming like an independent curator. But there are breaks in this. I don't have, I'm closing here with the last two slides. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go into the counter narrations or into like the common curatorial practice I wanted to highlight, but it's my bad. I took too much time. But just to make a few examples of how the commons interfered in a conflictive way with Harald Zeman, there are some things that can be traced even in his diary. This is a quote from the diary of Zeman leading up to when Attitudes Become Form, which are published in at least in 2 different publications. A very interesting diary in 1969. He roams Europe and beyond Europe to scout for the seminal exhibition When Attitudes Become Form. And there's a little quote when he meets, I think in November, he meets, or earlier, I don't remember, when he meets Piero Girardi, which unfortunately passed away a couple of weeks ago. He was a very important figure, not only for Arte Povera, but for the whole, I think, contemporary art of Italy. And he was someone who was very radical. He practiced many times a kind of withdrawal from the institutional art circuit in order to experiment his art making and his creativity, sorry for the bad word, very close to social movements. And Gilardi was invited to When Attitudes Become Form, but he pulled out voluntarily just before the exhibition opened because he didn't like the concept. And why he did not like the concept eventually? Zeman tells us that when he meets Gilardi, Gilardi wanted the whole thing to be an artists' gathering for which the exhibition would emerge of its own accord. No shipping, no art dealers, just artist discussion and the self-reflective criticism of a museum. So basically, Gilardi wanted to transform When Attitudes Become Form in an assembly. He wanted to transform the exhibition in an assembly. He wanted to cut out art dealers, and he wanted the Kunsthalle of Bern to, let's say, to trigger a process of self-reflection and consequent transformation. History says Zeman had other plans. Zeman had other plans. First of all, the exhibition we all know was sponsored by Philip Morris, so a major American tobacco multinational. But he also had other plans aesthetically and politically speaking. He was not interested in promoting art commons or the principle of the common in art, was much more interesting in promoting individual mythologies, was much more interesting even by recalling the spirit of 1968 to highlight how art is this tool for accelerating, I would say, individual intensities. Last slide. Can I go for the last slide? Can I go? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Last slide, just to finish the first part. We will leave the second part for next year. I don't know. But anyway, this is also an interesting, 2 interesting emails. So this tells about the very short and controversial relationship between Lucy Lippard, which is, she's still alive, fortunately, another seminal curator of the 60s, feminist, radical, anti-war, one of the co-founders of Art Workers Coalition in New York City. So I would say an amazing Ausstellungsmacher too, an amazing makers of exhibition, but at the same time, very embedded in body and spirits in the movement of 1968. And the letter that he sent to Harald Zeman in 1972, just after or before, during Documenta 5, says, "Who the hell are you calling a whore?" And basically is a denunciation of the fact that there were not enough women artists included in Documenta 1972. And but the funny thing is that actually Zeman never called anyone a whore. The problem was real, but the violent reaction that Lucy Lippard had was because the guerrilla art action group made of John Hendricks and Jean Toche basically wrote a fake Zeman letter to denounce the real problem of the lack of women in Documenta 1972, in which a fake letter by Zeman to them, in which the fake Zeman says women are all, like using like a quote from Hitler, women are all whore, they need to stay in the kitchen and prepare soup. So, I mean, that's it. Okay, thank you very much.